Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the NOAA Central Library. I'm Katie, and I will be the librarian host running this webinar today. The library's seminar program provides an educational forum for the presentation of ideas, research updates, and news in support of NOAA's mission. I'm excited to bring another transition fireside chat to you today. Please note, this presentation is being recorded and your name, email, and questions will be shared with the presenters after the fact. As an attendee, you are muted, so please place all questions in the question panel. Questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. If you have technical issues, such as no audio or visuals, please try logging off GoToWebinar and back on, as that solves most issues. If it does not, please feel free to chat me and I can try and help you troubleshoot. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fiona Horsfall to get this started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third Fireside Chat on transitions. This is a series designed to enable participants to come away with a broader understanding of research and development transition at NOAA. Our first was on the importance of transition plans. The second was on research to commercialization. And this one is on the R&D process with a focus on the transition process itself. Our panelists are made up of members from the Research and Development Enterprise Committee, known as the RDEC, and the Line Office Transition Managers Committee, the LOTMC. Our moderator for today will be Gary Matlock. And Gary Matlock is the DA for Science for OAR. And Dr. Matlock is responsible for guiding, evaluating, and managing OAR's research and development portfolio. Our panelists' bios are posted on the NOAA library site for this chat, so I will just briefly introduce them. Eric Bayler from NESDIS is from the Center for Satellite Applications and Research, known as STAR, and he serves as the Principal Scientist for Policy, the Satellite Ocean Data Assimilation Program Manager, and as the Satellite Sea Service Salinity Science Team Lead. That's a mouthful. Annette Hollingshead, also from OAR, is from AOML, the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Lab in Miami, where she supports research that encompasses ocean, coastal, and atmospheric studies as, excuse me, and she serves as its first dedicated transition manager at a NOAA laboratory altogether. Tabitha Huntemann is from NWS. She serves as the program manager in NWS's Office of Science and Technology Integration, where she coordinates the development of multi-year and multifaceted research to operations plans spanning the breadth of NWS science and technology requirements. Dan Barrie is also from OAR, is a program manager in the Climate Program Office, where he manages the Modeling, Analysis, Predictions, and Projections Program, more commonly known as MAP, the Assessments Program, and he also serves on the National Climate Assessment Steering Committee. And Carlis is also from OAR, and he serves as the Deputy Director of NOAA's Global Systems Laboratory, known as GSL, in Boulder, Colorado. At GSL, he's responsible for leading the scientific and information technology efforts of the laboratory. A note of order, while this session will be posted on YouTube, it is not training. The development of transition plans is an emerging process, and ORTA, my office, will be developing formalized training that will be updated as needed, and we will be posting information on when that training will be available. One other thing I wanted to mention was that in addition to this session and the previous sessions, we are planning upcoming sessions in December and for next March, and we'll be making those announcements soon. So without further ado, I would like to hand it now to Gary Matlock. Gary?
Thanks, Fiona, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it might be where you are. I'd like to just take us back for a moment to the NOAA administrative order that deals with transition of research and development into a variety of uses. The first NAO on this topic was developed now in about 2008, I believe. We've gone through 2 updates of that. And central to that NAO and the associated handbook is the notion of transition plans. Transition plans are the best hope, at least of which we know now, in accelerating and accomplishing the transition of our R&D into a variety of uses. The fundamental notion behind it is that both the research and development side and the ultimate user of that particular R&D are coupled together in a written document that is signed by the leadership within the organizations in NOAA that are designed or that are anticipating or that want to use the R&D that's conducted. Whether or not transition plans will accomplish the goal, which is to further our ability to cross the valley of death, is unknown. We don't know whether or not they're going to work, but they are a tool that's not a tool in and of themselves. They are a tool that's designed to try to help us do transitions better. So we've conducted through the LOTMC and now the RDEC a variety of efforts to try to further information about these. And today's Fireside Chat is structured in a way that will continue the dialogue that we've begun. We have 8 questions that have been developed for our panelists today. We'll ask each question, give a couple of folks a couple of minutes each to respond to them. We'll end our discussion with the panelists, and then we'll open the floor up to whomever might have whatever question you might have today. I would be remiss if I did not recognize Francis Choi. Francis is the current executive secretary for the LOTMC and has been instrumental in putting this together, hopefully in a way that everyone gets something out of it. So with that brief introduction, let me start off with the first question. It goes for our panelist, Eric Bayler from NESDIS. And the question, Eric, is how does one determine if a transition plan is needed? Eric?
Thank you, Gary. I'd like to start off with noting that the R&D efforts requiring mutual understanding and coordination of requirements, resources, schedule, output, and utility need a transition plan to ensure success. It is important that LOs develop and provide tailored guidance for criteria, content, and process. And this is quite important from the perspective that each LO has different kinds of transitions. Not everything is a widget, not everything is a product, not everything's a process. You have things like knowledge as well, and this is something the LOTMC is trying to work on as we speak, and better clarity on that. It also is clearly important to judge the magnitude and complexity as well as the type of transition as factors for a transition plan. And ultimately, a transition plan is needed when there needs to be a handshake between the developer and the recipient, as well as for identifying internal scheduling and budgeting. The transition plan specifies the terms of that handshake. And in general, per the NAO, transition plans are recommended for research and development maturing between readiness level 4 and readiness level 5. In other words, advancing the research and development from the experimental environment to a relevant environment. At this point, it is anticipated that there is a preliminary commitment for maturing the research and development efforts through transition to its end use, and it is recognized that transition plans can include performance caveats. So if something doesn't pan out, well, then that's part of the world we have to live in. Gary. You're on mute, Gary.
Thank you. I've not got that down yet. I haven't transitioned my brain to function with these buttons that I have to find. Anyway, our next question will go first to Dan Barrie from OAR, and it is, do all research and development projects need to transition?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And I'm glad you did the mute thing because I was getting really nervous trying to aim for the small target on my screen. So it's nice to lower the nervousness on that. Well, thanks for the question. So I think the short answer to this is no. The reason I think this is posed to me is because a lot of MAP's portfolio is focused on non-capital O operational transition projects. So we have a lot of work in our program that goes into applied use in many different respects, into like lowercase o operational use. So for example, I would consider improvements to GFDL's modeling systems to be, an enduring result of our investments, but certainly not the 99.9%, weather service operational standard. And then, other forms as well, which I think Eric touched on. So, without just saying no as a response to the question, a metaphor that I like to use to think about this is hearkening back to my time working at CBS way back, where you know, we would have kind of three components of the store. You have a stock room, you have the floor of the store, and you have kind of the end caps on the floor. You have the front window of the store, and you need all three of those components to be operating robustly. You need to be getting shipments in and have a full stock room with a variety of different products and different seasonal markings on those products. You need to bring those up onto the showroom so that you can actually sell those products and give people selection. And then you highlight some of those products to try to entice people into your larger system of activities, products, services, whatnot. And I think we operate analogously as an agency, but also in the research enterprise. I think that the metaphor, you know, helps describe the fact that a lot of research and development, as Eric said, may not actually result in something operational or something that goes through a robust transition planning process and an actual transition as laid out in the NAO. And we need to have this kind of tolerance of failure in some cases and be exploring, you know, the dark parts of the stock room, the boxes that are not under a light and the boxes that are under a light. And I think that's part of the kind of natural process of research. And ultimately it can end up on the showroom. It can end up in operational use and development or in the storefront window, but that's not always going to happen. And the NAO does not expect that of all research projects, research and development projects that NOAA funds.
Thanks, Dan. And same question, Danae, over to you. Just a refresher, do all R&D projects need to transition?
Yeah, I would agree with Dan, and I would say that no, that not all projects need to transition. I would say that, you know, many R&D projects that are being done across research laboratories in the private sector, in academia, you know, they're really there for understanding, for improving our scientific knowledge. And that particular aspect really doesn't mean that it's going to actually transition to an operational entity. And understanding that means that we have to, you know, take into account that, you know, not all things that we're doing within a research organization are going to transition. But, you know, for a laboratory like the Global Systems Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, that's really an applied research laboratory, would we like to see many of our things transition to operations? Absolutely. Absolutely, we would love to, because we are very in tune with what the needs are of our operational partner. But sometimes it doesn't happen. You know, sometimes we miss the mark, and we don't have the necessary resources on the operational end to be able to support that research improvement or advancement that we're proposing to that particular operational partner. So, you know, at the end of the day, sometimes it's a give and take. When you look at some of the things that we've done within the Global Systems Laboratory, we've had a lot of successes, but we've also had some challenges with getting transitions over into operations.
Thanks, Danae. So the next question is, how do transition plans fit into the R&D process? And first up for this one would be Tabitha from the Weather Service. Tabitha?
Thanks, Gary. So transition plans really help PIs or researchers and potential recipients coordinate, collaborate, and communicate. That's sort of the 3 C's that I try to keep in mind when we work with transition plans. You know, they help succinctly outline the general steps toward an optimal transition and provide an idea of the breadth of work to get from point A to point B. So, you know, speaking back to what Dan and Danae were just saying about not everything needs to transition, the transition plans really help us set the stage for a successful transition. Maybe we won't get there, but the transition plan really should set us up to help with that successful transition. So, you know, the information in the transition plan can be used for adopters to establish a timeline to implement operationally if it's destined for big O operations, and develop cost estimates for, you know, the one-time transition cost, or what's the O&M tail, the operations and maintenance tail, because sometimes that gets overlooked. The plans can really help identify and remedy potential red flags and identify opportunities to more directly meet the recipient's requirements. And that's really where we're getting at, making these transitions successful. These transition plans are intended to be living documents, so they should be updated throughout the R&D process. We're asking, how do they fit in the process? They kind of live throughout that process. As you get, further down the funnel, higher readiness levels, you might have more detail as that project matures. But it's all about explaining what work will actually get it to be transitioned, and it really helps us set the stage for transition success.
Thank you, ma'am. Same question again. How do transition plans fit into the R&D process? And Annette, over to you. You're on mute. Annette, I think you're on mute.
Best laid plans. Okay, so Tabitha really did a great job explaining how they fit into the R&D process. If I was to describe it from my own perspective, I would say that a transition plan is really designed to guide transition efforts for the proposed capability toward uses to meet mission requirements such as operation, application, commercialization, and other uses. It acts as a sort of roadmap for the project to help keep it on track and improve the chances of a successful transition. Much to what Tabitha said, you can identify potential risks and then address possible mitigation efforts ahead of time early on so you don't derail your project. And she also mentioned the 3 C's, and I kind of talk about the W's, the four W's plus the how. But a plan is really the thing that addresses the what, where, when, and why, and also the how of describing the project. So, through describing the project and identifying the adopters, developing a project timeline and cost benefits, the why, and defining that criteria for success, and laying out an implementation strategy, a way forward, a proposed unfolding of events, if you will. Another thing I thought to mention is that it's important to note that transitions are not always internal to NOAA. So for instance, we transition things to, say, state agencies, municipalities, health departments. So those receiving organizations are not necessarily going to be familiar with NOAA's process. So this is where it's really important to have a well-formed plan so that you can clarify the expectations on both sides well ahead of time.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up is, what does it mean to have a transition plan as a living document? Tabitha began to speak to this, but to try to expand upon that, provide more information would be Annette.
Okay, unmuted this time. Okay, I really love this question. I really appreciate it. I think it's a really important question, and one that I go to first when I'm talking to folks who are just new to the transition planning process or starting to draft a transition plan, because really a transition plan is intended to provide a vision for the proposed capability. Science doesn't stand still, and research and development aren't always a straight path. So this plan does require some flexibility, and Tabitha mentioned some of this too, enabling that room to develop and grow as the project grows or moves along in phases. It is a living document so that it can evolve, and this can be accomplished by revisiting it, as Tabitha mentioned, on regular basis, periodic basis, or depending on how long the project is and how it's unfolding, as an as-needed basis. And then you can amend it with increasing detail as the project matures. And then also, transition gates are also a good way to design in some contingencies. They can provide those contingencies and flexibility to modify that proposed path forward if needed. And most equally important that I always stress to people is that a transition plan is not a binding document. It's not like a legal document. people get a little intimidated when you hand them a document with all these signature lines on it, and a lot of those signatures go way up the leadership chain, so it can be a little overwhelming and intimidating. But really, those signatures are an acknowledgement of that proposed path forward, agreeing to that vision, and approving the project to move along in phases.
Super. Thanks, Annette, very much. And Eric, same question for you. What does it mean to have a transition plan as a living document?
Okay, my comments are going to largely mimic Annette's. I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that R&D is not linear, and that it's also subject to highly variable conditions, for example, funding, personnel, high performance computing availability, equipment, all of those kinds of things. And so the transition partnership, because it's a partnership, must have a mechanism to address and accommodate such vagaries. And the transition plan consequently may need modification when it becomes apparent that the current plan is no longer viable or needs to be adjusted. And understanding which aspects of the transition plan are more rigid will guide project management decisions. And so routine review and oversight of the project's progress with respect to the transition plan allows early mitigation efforts to be implemented. And this is largely very reliant upon user engagement, because that will tell how it's progressing towards satisfying the utility of the end user. And so that's what evolves as the capability comes, as you're doing your R&D and the capability becomes out either more than you expected or less than you expected, and you have to put additional constraints on it or add additional capabilities. That all goes back to this, that it's a living document, and so that means it's an ongoing conversation and it's an ongoing partnership, and that's the biggest thing that I'd like to emphasize. Gary.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Our next question is, are there similarities or differences in the R&D process across line offices? Additionally, how do line offices work together to fit those differences into plans? And up to tackle this one first is Danae.
Thanks, Gary. This is a really good question. And, from an OAR perspective, we work a lot with the National Weather Service. So the projects that we receive funding for definitely require a transition plan. We usually have our National Weather Service partner identified, whether that's, the Environmental Modeling Center, the Storm Prediction Center, or one of the other national centers out there that we work with. We have those folks identified, and we work closely with them to start developing that particular transition plan. If this particular project is pretty much at the early stage, just kind of like a readiness level 4, it can be a challenge actually to develop a transition plan at that particular point, because you're not exactly sure of where the research is going to take you. It goes back to what they were just talking about, research not being a linear process. But there is value in starting to think about what that transition would look like, once you get to a RL8 going to a RL9, right? And so having the transition plan as a living document is really, really important, and it's very valuable because it actually helps us from a research perspective, really to just get our thoughts together and put them down on paper and start to basically in some level negotiate with the different offices that we work with. And so, I know that we work closely with the Office of Science and Technology Integration, that's Tabitha's office, to work on get our transition plan signed through their governance process. We talked about it earlier, consistent collaboration, extremely important with the operational partner. And that's really key to helping with regards to the understanding and the maintenance of, the O&M part of the transition, making sure that aspect is actually discussed ahead of time. And so, it's our responsibility as researchers to make sure that operational partner is basically going along for the ride with us down that RL train, basically.
All right, thanks, Danae. Annette, the same question to you. Are there similarities or differences in the R&D process across the line offices, and how do the line offices work together to fit those differences into plans?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. This is really a timely question for me. I joined AOML just shy of a year ago, so still ramping up really. But as their transition manager, and Fiona had mentioned this is the first dedicated role in a NOAA lab as that. In order to spin up for that role and really get a sense of what I needed to do and how to do it, I reached out to several other labs as well as line offices to really get a sense of how they handled the process from end to end. And very quickly, I realized that their processes were equally as unique as the labs themselves. And through a lot of those conversations and really better understanding the shared and unique processes and challenges, and knowing that the labs don't really have this dedicated resource to facilitate the process, the idea to initiate a dedicated forum for cross-lab collaboration formed, and we formed the OER Lab Transition Management Community of Practice. So we established that. We had our first meeting, I think, last week. It was really well attended and very much appreciated. I think it's going to be a great resource where we can all share best practices, you know, what's working for them, what's not working, how one's process works in another, and we could take pieces of that and build a better process. So I think that's going to be a great way to tackle this. Also through my participation on the ORTA Tiger team, I realized that the review process and the signature process and the timeline to complete a transition plan, really, they vary widely across line offices. And one of ORTA Tiger team tasks is to develop transition plan guidance and tools to provide a consistent framework to help streamline and facilitate this process. So we're really working hard at that, and we really look forward to providing some great materials to help facilitate all this.
Thank you very much. Our next question goes to Dan Barrie, and it is, at what stage of R&D would the review or approval process occur?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think Danae kind of alluded to this, if not answered it to some extent in his response to the last question, but you know, according to the NAO, it's really when you get into the readiness level 4 or 5 stage where you have to start the process of actually writing and gaining approval and review of transition plans. So, you know, the way that I think about it is there's a critical jump between stages 4 and 5. You should look at the NAO if you're not familiar with the readiness levels to see descriptions of what's happening in the various levels. But between 4 and 5, you're entering what the NAO refers to as a relevant environment, which I think is the key term in my mind, that triggers wanting to have a transition plan. Where relevant environment could mean that you're actually starting a really intensive collaboration. If you're transitioning something to an operational center, for example, you may actually have a collaborator on the project from the operational center at that point, and you're doing work, you know, very much in a faux, if not pseudo real operational environment at that point in the R&D process. But it could also mean that for techniques that are going to be really dependent upon NOAA facilities like computational facilities, that you're then actually in a physical environment where you have to start, you know, constraining your R&D process toward that environment. So I think the relevant environment step is in my mind how I usually try to trigger the idea of needing to develop a transition plan. The NAO lays out the processes, and I don't want to belabor those. I don't think the question is actually geared at those, but there are multiple steps that are recommended for the review and approval process. I did want to mention from personal experience, my program used to manage the climate test bed a number of years ago, and we found we were operating at a time where the NAO hadn't been disseminated strongly throughout the agency, so we were kind of developing our own processes somewhat in parallel with the development of the NAO, and we found that really engaging the operational partner extremely early, even at the letter of intent stage, as we did in one such competition, was really useful. I think Annette highlighted it well. You really want to know that there's a willingness on the operational side as well, before we engage our external partners in some cases to do extremely laborious things like write proposals and submit proposals to the agency. So you want to have some sense that there's a commitment, which is kind of a pseudo transition plan kernel. And the NAO, in my reading, is flexible enough that it allows for the beginnings of that kind of a handshake process at a variety of different stages. But then there is the de facto desire to have a physical transition plan develop once you make that transition from a stage 4 to a stage 5 project.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. And same question for you, Tabitha. At what stage of R&D would the review or approval occur?
Well, thanks for this question. I think this is good timing because I think it sort of brings together what Annette was talking about the differences between line office and lab approaches, and what Danae was talking about the influence, speaking on behalf of the Weather Service here, you know, the influence of the Weather Service governance on transition plans, and what Dan was just saying about, you know, how this kind of really gets triggered when you're moving into the relevant environment. Speaking specifically to the review of transition plans, in Weather Service, we've actually established a transition plan review process to aid coordination across the Weather Service service delivery portfolios. So, you know, as Dan was saying, you know, these reviews kind of take place in that develop and demonstrate phases of the R&D process when you're in that relevant environment, kind of RL5 and higher, when that project is sort of sufficiently mature to have a path to operations, but there's still enough time to modify that plan to really better position it for transition success. So these Weather Service transition plan review meetings provide an opportunity before the transition plans are even signed for the various Weather Service portfolio leads to be made aware of the emerging R2O or R2X projects for future planning purposes. And it also allows the portfolios to provide feedback on that proposed transition plan before the plans are even signed. So that kind of feedback is highlighting challenges that, you know, will need to be addressed to actually get this into, I mean, for Weather Service, generally big O operations. You know, part of the transition plan is identifying challenges, but as the R&D person, you may not be aware of operational challenges on the receiving end. So this is an opportunity for the portfolios to give you that kind of feedback that you need to sort of set yourself up for success. You know, we take detailed minutes at these meetings, and then actually when we send the plans for signature by the Weather Service LOTM and the Weather Service AA, we actually join the minutes with the transition plans as sort of evidence that this has been collaborated across Weather Service. People had a chance to weigh in, you know, any red flags or concerns have been elevated and addressed as needed. So, you know, we found that having this review process in place before the approval has actually helped streamline that approval process, because there's greater confidence that all of the parties affected by the transition have had an opportunity to review the transition plan and provide feedback to sort of bolster it and make it the best plan it can be.
Thank you, ma'am. Eric, you're up next, and it is, the next question is, what is expected of the recipient of R&D during the R&D process and with the transition plan?
Thank you, Gary. A critical point of the transition plan is to ensure that the maturity of the user's needs and applications align with the development and how that's progressing. And consequently, the transition plan needs to specify roles and responsibilities and resources as expected, such that the recipient is ready to implement and exploit upon delivery. And that's one of the things that NOAA's had a challenge with is we get research projects elevated up to research readiness level 8, and then they sit there because the recipient is not ready for whatever reasons, whether it be resources or waiting for HPC update. You know, it could be all sorts of things. Transitions within an organization typically are less problematic due to structurally close coordination. And from my perspective, the recipient is expected to first provide the clearest possible guidance on requirements and flexibilities, particularly with regards to time and resource constraints, because that helps guide how fast and what kind of prioritization it gets placed within the developing organization. Next is during the demonstration phase, which is research readiness levels, I believe 6 and 7 and 8, provide feedback on the output's performance to inform the utility and the suitability, as well as subsequent development and improvements, because research and development is cyclical. And then prepare for transition acceptance to ensure readiness for implementation and exploitation. And also, from the whole enterprise perspective, is to assist with the socialization and broader user engagement for the effort's use, because while something may be focused for one specific application, there's clearly broader applications out there, either something new and different or a broader set of users as we start working with, for example, our regional partners, our private partners, our other agency and international partners. So socialization is really, really important, because it also helps people be aware that it's there and then to exploit it, because we put in the resources to develop it. And that's how you start getting it into the field. And that way you get the feedback on any improvements that need to be made.
All right, thank you, Eric. And we'll go back to Tabitha for this one as well. What's expected of the recipient during the R&D process and with the transition plans?
So kind of speaking from that recipient perspective and speaking to some of the points that Eric just made, in Weather Service, we actually identify a Weather Service point of contact at the receiving office for R&D projects. So if a proposal listed an operational collaborator, often that is the person who might be the POC. But if there are no Weather Service personnel listed, we work with the receiving office to identify somebody who can help work with the PI to develop the transition plan and really serve as the liaison between the R&D folks and all Weather Service units that are involved in the operational transition. So the POC really serves as a liaison with, test bed managers or the Office of Dissemination, policy, operational forecaster, social science, anybody who may be impacted by this R&D effort. That POC is responsible for doing that outreach, that socialization that Eric was talking about, and getting any information related to necessary transition criteria or activities or costs to inform the transition plan with the goal of increasing the likelihood of successful R2O transition after that project completion. The transition plan review meeting that I mentioned in my last answer is actually the POC's responsibility. They actually give that short briefing to the portfolio leads on a brief overview of the project and detailed information on that proposed transition path. So the POC should work really closely with the R&D folks to share information and maximize the utility of that experimental capability within Weather Service so that we can do these successful RL9 transitions and maximize the utility of the project and the actual transition plan.
All right, thank you very much. We're on to our last question, and be for Danae and Dan. And I'll add a bit of facetiousness in the question, and it is, what is the value, beyond being a bureaucratic nightmare, of transition plans during the R&D process? I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that kind of comment, that these things are a waste of time. All they do is cost us and interfere with our doing the work that we care about and should be doing. So, Danae, with that sort of negative introduction, you get to tell us what the value really is of these plans.
All right, I just want to put on record that I did not say that. That did not come out of my mouth, Gary. In terms of our the value, I think it was already mentioned earlier by Tabitha. Ensuring that the NWS service delivery portfolios are aware of the emerging research to operations projects. It really does kind of help with their planning purposes. It actually also helps with regard to helping us to scope out what the resource needs are on the research side, but also on the operational side, so that the O&M is taken care of as well. It allows those portfolios to give us feedback on the particular project and the transition path, to let us know what are going to be some of the challenges with regards to transitioning that research into operations. And it allows us to basically start to think about how are we going to actually address those particular challenges that they actually have identified. You know, some other things that I think that it shows value in is it really does outline the roles and responsibilities on both sides, whether you're on the research side or on the operational side. I think that once the transition plan is signed, there is some comfort between the two organizations with regards to moving that particular project forward. There's clarity, there's visibility, there's some trust that's starting to be built, especially when it's signed. And then lastly, the last item that I would add is that I think for an external a scientist, it actually gives them an opportunity to actually contribute to the R2O process, and it gives them some understanding and visibility into what that process actually entails. I would probably say it's more of a headache if I'm coming from the external community. If I'm coming from the research academic community, getting involved in the NOAA R2O process, I would imagine, yeah, you're going to need some medication after you go through that process.
Thanks, Danae. Now, do you have a recommendation on the Medicaid? No, forget that. So Dan, same question for you. What is the value of the transition plan during the R&D process?
Yeah, well, Danae's answer was really pretty fantastic. And I wanted to, I guess I don't have anything to add to it. I wanted to kind of highlight it in a different way. So Danae kind of started out talking about a lot of mechanical things, and these are things that have come up in the comments throughout today's roundtable or fireside chat. I can't remember what we're calling this, but you know, these mechanical aspects of like planning and resource planning and need identification and feedback processes and roles and responsibilities. But I really liked Danae's second part of the answer about comfort. So I would highlight the fact that research is performed by human beings, and it is therefore a highly social process. And we can have a whole variety of mechanical constraints around it and rules and regulations and things like that. But it's people working together, and especially when you're transitioning something, and in particular across organizations. And I think that an effective thing that transition planning can do, although it does have risks, as Danae noted, which I also want to elaborate on, but an effective thing that it can do is to reduce, I think, the degrees of freedom in the process, where the potential craziness that can happen later if you don't have expectations and a process of building comfort in the system, it allows many more degrees of freedom for failure, I think, of a project ultimately. And so there's I think a little bit of an undersold part of the value of transition plans, that they're socially very important to create these robust linkages between researchers and operationalists and different institutions, and very necessary in that respect. And then, you know, Gary, you said bureaucratic nightmare. Danae suggested medication and whatnot. I wanted to, I guess, highlight, even though it's not totally a response to this question, but that fact that I think as an agency, we also, especially when working with the external community, have to be conscious of the way that we're applying those rules and regulations and the expectations we're setting. The external community is a customer of ours, and so we're actually maybe not always knowledgeable of the fact that we're in the business of customer service. Researchers can go elsewhere for research grants. They can work with other agencies, and if we do create bureaucratic nightmares, and if we create situations where researchers do need medication in order to work with us continually, they're going to go elsewhere for their research funding, and ultimately that will lead to a failure of our ability to transition research. So I think whenever we develop regulations and rules, we have to be very conscious of that to make the transition planning process something that people do want to engage with, because they see the value, but also because it isn't a bureaucratic nightmare as much as we can make it not a bureaucratic nightmare. So I wanted to emphasize that as well, but I love Danae's answer, and I hope that I've amplified a few aspects of that successfully.
Thanks, Dan. That takes care of our panel responses to these questions. And if I may impose just a moment and respond a bit to sort of the comments at large that I think are applicable. The whole notion of trying to accelerate transitions into operations, applications, commercialization, and other uses is in fact a culture change through which NOAA is going. And that culture change is founded on the notion that the more we communicate between what's going on in the R&D arena and the potential user community, the better we will be at getting the R&D that we think needs to be done, whether it's from the research push or the research pull side, the more likely we are to see that R&D make a difference to society, which is what NOAA's mission is all about. It's trying to make society better. So if we increase the communication, we increase the partnership, we increase the trust, we increase the awareness, the information exchange, we think that the likelihood of our being able to benefit from the R&D faster, to a greater extent, and more importantly, in the impact arena, the more likely we are to achieve that. So this very, very different culture, that the whole notion of the NAO and the handbook and the elements of the transition plan, the fireside chats that we're doing, some of the workshops that we have held, the training that's now being contemplated and developed, the more likely we are to affect what we want as an outcome, and not just a set of processes to develop outputs. And it's my pleasure to have participated in the meeting today and the panel discussion so far. And I would at this point turn it over to Francis, who can help manage us through whatever questions might have come in or might come in as we get through the next 15 minutes or so. So thank you all for participating. Thank the panelists for being a part of this, for the thoughtfulness and the responses that you've given. And Francis, over to you.
Thanks, Gary. So I have several questions, but I'm going to start out with this one. Is for the panelists and the moderator, and also for ORTA, Fiona Horsfall, according to the WPO's SBS R2O workshop, the principal investigators often felt a burden of writing the transition plan by themselves and felt the process was jarring and complex. Therefore, what organization and/or procedural changes can we do to make this process more straightforward for our principal investigator?
So Francis, you want me to take that on because I had made the comment to you. One of the functions of ORTA is to provide support for transitions, and we are developing hopefully a system that will make the transition plan development process much easier than it is right now. So now, whereas we've heard from the panelists that it's quite an intimidating process, bureaucratic nightmare, and may need medical treatment, we're going to make it a lot simpler for you. We're hoping to develop a system whereby you will be able to go and, using Annette's language, it'll be like a salad bar, depending on what you need for your transition plan. You'll be able to pick and choose. We're also going to be streamlining the signature process for transition plans. And it should be something that makes life easier for everybody developing them. It will not be a huge challenge, but as noted, this is a paradigm shift for NOAA.
And from the NESDIS perspective, this is something that NESDIS needs to work on, because we have to deal with basically two flavors of R&D. One is through the typical things that we see parallel to OAR, but we also have to deal with all the things that happen through the acquisition process for the satellites. And we're trying to ensure that there's parallel structure there and that they have the same kinds of gates and things which are important for the transition plans. But clearly there's things that are totally different magnitudes, and providing a line office level guidance as to what are the criteria for the ones that do need transition plans within the line offices, what content is necessary, and then what is the process for actually getting that approved up through the lab structures and then up to the AA. Because when I spoke with Dr. Spinrad this summer, he was highly focused on transition plans. So it's coming from the very top, and he was highly interested in understanding the LO engagement with that, even at the AA level, and Dr. Volz there was acknowledging that. And so we have to ensure that we have a process that is efficient and effective for doing that. And so I thank OAR's efforts to help pull some of this material that we can then leverage for our efforts as well. Thank you.
All right, I have another question. This has to do with NRDD and transition plans. Is the NRDD repository for transition plans, are they accessed and read there, or is it just a demonstration of accomplishment of process when a transition plan appears in the NRDD?
Yeah, so I think I will take a stab at this one, Francis. The short answer to the question, first part of the question is yes, transition plans are housed in the NRDD as a single repository that anyone who can access the NRDD can access the transition plans and get information out of them. That housing, that location of the plans and the ability to get to them allows us across all of NOAA to know what we are doing in the R&D arena that has in its future the possibility of a transition and where those transitions stand. So the R&D projects are updated each year as a planned effort. At the end of the year, the R&D projects are supposed to be updated relative to what was accomplished. So the transition plan changes that may occur can be housed as they're occurring in the NRDD and then accessed by folks to find out more about exactly what's being done and where things stand. And I think that's got both parts of the questions.
Thank you, Gary. I have another question here. There's still some negative connotations when research doesn't transition. It might be helpful to point out value in work that doesn't transition. Can the panel think of examples about these? Can you guys think of any specific examples?
Yes, Francis. One example comes to mind. It's not in my field, but it's something that comes to my mind, is if we're talking in the ecosystem research or ecological research, you may do a population study to inform things down the road. And that's not expected to transition into operations as we think about it, but it is an information transition. And we're trying to look at how we represent that in the LOTMC. We've been going around having a lot of discussion on how we deal with these things, which are information and knowledge. Some of the knowledge things can get captured in processes, but others of them are just information for informed decision making, whether it's in terms of policy or regulatory kinds of things for the National Marine Fisheries. That is it a transition? Is it just making the information available? Or, for example, we put out a peer review publication. Is it a transition to the public domain at that point, and that completes the transition? So there's a lot of conversation happening on that as we speak.
I would just add, from a GSL perspective, we have a couple of different systems that did not transition to operations that were actually funded by, programs within WPO. And I don't fully know the history of all of that, but it can definitely be a challenge, especially when you're funded to do the work, and then it actually doesn't get into operations. And so then when that actually happens, you start to look for other operational partners and try to find ways to either transition that to an external entity, maybe in the private sector, or you bite the bullet and you kind of keep it little o, and you just run it in, little o operations within your research environment. But that can definitely be a challenge, and it can cause some consternation and, lack of trust between the operational partner and the research entity, because, sometimes priorities change. Priorities on the operational side change, and then the research organization is kind of left holding the bag with regards to all of the investment that's been made in that particular project.
Yeah, if I could build on Danae's comments there, that's an important point. When things get up and are run, you've made the scientific progress, the maturation of the R&D, but then it doesn't transition for whatever reason, perhaps the lack of operations and maintenance funding on the recipient's end or some other such. And then when you are running that effort as a little o, R&D being used in a quasi-operational sense, this is problematic because then R&D dollars are being used for that capacity that are not being applied to replenish the well of the R&D at the lower levels to build through. And so this is something I know Dr. Spinrad has worked with the RTAP program to push those things out of RL8 into RL9, but that's only at one end. You have other aspects and other levels as well that have that similar kind of challenge.
I have one very specific example, and it is a program called SHOUT, which used a high-flying, long-endurance, uncrewed system called the Global Hawk. And the purpose of that research was to see whether or not the Global Hawk could be used to improve intensity and track forecasts for hurricanes. The research was very expensive. It cost a lot of money, conducted over several years, did not have a partner envisioned at the outset. There was no operational mindset when it was begun. The results of the effort was such that, yes, indeed, that particular uncrewed aircraft could increase hurricane track and intensity forecasts. We don't use the Global Hawk. It turned out that there really was no recipient interested in flying it, paying for it, paying for the O&M costs, and so on. That was the primary reason for that effort not having been put into operations. And as a result, we're no longer pursuing the idea of using a high altitude, long endurance aircraft in order to get the improvements. Instead, we're now looking at what are called gliders in the water to try to get better estimates of temperature in front of hurricanes to improve, in particular, intensity forecasts. That seems to have some potential, but at this particular point in time, as far as I know, there is no current transition plan developed, and there is no recipient that's been identified as a user or operator if those technologies turn out to be successful. So back to you, Francis.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and all the other questions that I've been getting, I will get the panelists to take a look at them, and then we will come back to you guys through an email. But this is one last question is, if you have a magic wand, what will you change anything about transition plans or the transition plan process? Because there are some downsides that we see that. And what would it be and why?
Well,
oh, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, sorry. I guess to put a positive cast on it, from my experience with transition planning, I honestly think that this new paradigm and the work that Fiona is leading has a lot of promise, because a lot of the problems that I experienced in leading a transition research program had to do with a really high degree of ad hoc or bespoke process and a lot of difficulty navigating that process. Finding the way to get signatures was so difficult in the past. It consumed hundreds of emails and lots of documents and back and forth in time. So having a group of people who are focused and have it as their mission to simplify things and also provide the customer service that I alluded to earlier is going to be really important, I think, and lowering the barrier to entry will be really important. I think that Fiona's group hopefully can accomplish that. Full faith, Fiona.
Thanks, Dan, for that plug. We're going to do that. We're not quite there yet. We've just started, but we're definitely going to get there, and we're making tremendous headway. And I see that Francis has been adding into the chat there our website, orta.research.noaa.gov, where you can find more information.
So with that, I'm gonna, oh, sorry, go ahead, Vanessa.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think making it simple, it could definitely speed up the process. Dan mentioned the signature process is still really difficult, and at some level, I still think that there's some misunderstanding with regards to what signing off on a transition plan actually means. That particular kind of education still, I feel like needs to happen for us to actually be able to move forward. And I know there's some ideas out there about collaboration plans. Collaborating a little bit earlier, but we all have to remember that there's a cost to collaboration. There's a cost to development of transition plans. We got to remember that many of our scientists have to write, reports. They have to write publications. They have to write uh, a myriad of other things that are kind of going on. And so, an additional burden with regards to new writing assignments can definitely slow down some of the research as well. So, I think that there's plenty that could change with regards to this particular process. And I hope, working with the ORTA office, we'll see some of that.
I'm going to turn to Katie, turn back to Katie for her to wrap up the seminar. Thank you, everybody, to participating.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Just a reminder, we did record this, and as Francis said, if we didn't get to your questions, we will be addressing those offline via email. This will be up on the library's YouTube channel shortly, so please check that out and pass it on to your colleagues. But with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful, safe, and healthy rest of their Tuesday. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.